the rack snaps, public punishment. The ratchet pinged and the executioner tightened his grip on the wooden key while a man on the rack hissed for breath. Suspicion ran through the warden when he heard that thin metallic sound. He stepped forward and crouched over a seam in the assembly. The audience leaned closer. The condemned sucked air and worked his hands against the ropes. From the first 3 pulls the central problem was visible, a small noise, a small crack, a decision that would decide who lived and who died. The executioner had worked the rack for 20 years. He moved with the blunt certainty of a man who had practiced cruelty until it fit like a uniform. He tightened, checked the ratchet, wiped the grease from his gauntleted hand on the apron and set his jaw. That ritual kept his reputation and his pay. The warden, ledger pressed under an arm, watched the key turn and counted entries aloud, partly to steady himself and partly to keep witnesses attentive. Hold it. The warden, pushing his spectacles up his nose. Hold what? The executioner answered in the same flat voice he used on condemned men. The joint. There is a sound. I will check. The warden's fingers worked at a small iron plate. The audience shifted, and the condemned quieted into a wet, pleading breathing. The first shift arrived inside that inspection. Suspicion moved to alarm. The warden pried the plate loose. His fingertips smelled of oil, his spectacles flashed candlelight. He pointed at a thin hairline fracture on a hidden cog, a seam in the metal smeared thin with old grease and a fresh dark smear of blood. The warden, see this. The executioner stared without answering. Warden, the executioner after a pause, we cannot delay. The court expects this sentence. The men out there expect to watch. His voice tried for firmness and found only thinness. The condemned whispered. Please, the word came as a breathy scrape from the straps where his hands bled. He reached instinctively toward the keepsake under his shirt. His fingers closed on air. He had been brought here to be a spectacle. Now he was a witness. They argued at the platform in short, sharp exchanges. The warden catalogued the crack and the ledger notes aloud. Entry month before last. Note, minor play. 3 weeks. Tightened assembly. 1 day. Unusual resistance. The executioner snapped. The court will not wait for our courage. The prisoner will not be set free because of a metal hair. Do the work. Guards shifted their weight at the edge of the days. Doubt arrived as the second emotion shift when the executioner hesitated and then pushed duty over caution. He cranked the ratchet. The gear gave a small complaint and caught. A thin ping sounded again. The condemned cried out. The warden's hand trembled against his ledger. Stop! Someone in the crowd shouted and a ripple of noise ran through the gallery. The executioner answered only with a pull. The ratchet slipped into place. The rack tightened. Every action from then on tightened the scene into inevitability. The executioner liked his routine because it kept the public catalogue intact. Punishment, spectacle, order. He moved because not moving would unmake him. The warden moved because cover mattered more than one life. The condemned moved because breath and pain are all a bound man owns. The crowd counted aloud the turns of the ratchet, not in numbers of mercy but in numbers of ritual. 5, 6, 7, called a watcher. The executioner turned the key again. The thin crack on the cog widened by a hair. The oil around it darkened. A guard jostled forward and the warden hissed, hold, and then shut his mouth. He weighed scandal against a broken machine. He thought of entries in the ledger and the quiet notes in its margins that hinted at recurring weakness. He thought of the list of men who had supervised the rack before him. He had, in a sense, been the ledger's custodian for years. He had choices and he knew the cost of each. The condemned screamed when the ratchet slipped. The executioner flinched as if struck. The hairline fracture failed. The cog fractured along its seam and the ratchet let go. The rack snapped back with a violence that shocked the gallery into silence. The executioner flew forward into the mechanism. Leather met iron, his gauntleted hands jammed inside the teeth just as the rack reversed and yanked. He made a single animal sound that was not a cry and not a prayer. Blood darkened his apron and splattered the stone. The condemned sagged in his bonds and then, as straps loosened in some places, he convulsed and fell partly free, coughing. Guards surged. The warden moved with a surgeon's bluntness. He pushed a handful of men aside to reach the machine and the broken man. He checked pulse and bone through torn cloth. He did not outrage. He catalogued, leg is broken, disarticulation at the shoulder, he said as if reading from a note. He barked, bring water. Remove witnesses from the line of sight. His voice cut orders into the crowd. The crowd did not obey immediately. Some backed away. Others shouted for the condemned to be finished. Someone cried for mercy. The warden's ledger slid out of his doublet as he leaned. A page fluttered open, and he brushed it closed with a single finger. In a dark alcove behind the rack, the warden later turned pages by candlelight. The ledger showed repeated marginalia. Play with care, tighten 3mm spring, observe next cycle. The notes had been written in different hands. One set of entries had an ink blot that matched a smear on the cog the warden had found. He set the ledger down and pinched the bridge of his nose. He could have ordered the rack fixed 2 months earlier. He had chosen to note it and move on. That decision pressed against him like a weight. Emotion shifted again into culpability and calculation. The warden spoke aloud to himself in the alcove. If this goes public, the council will ask who knew. If the council asks, who will they blame? He laid the ledger into his satchel and closed the clasp. Outside, the condemned tasted air without restraint for the first time in the afternoon. He coughed, then tried to speak. Executioner, he rasped. Why, he could not finish. His tongue tasted iron. The executioner rasped back between stolen breaths. I did not know. I did not know the cog was set to fail. He pushed the word out. It sounded like both truth and a plea for absolution. In the following hours, the hospital chests were brought. The executioner was carried away with one arm hanging useless. The condemned was led away with ropes still on his wrists, hair matted with sweat. The warden ordered the public gallery cleared. Officials took statements in curt lines of questions. The warden answered in measured sentences. He minimized where possible. When an official asked about maintenance schedules, he said, routine checks. No sign of imminent failure. His eyes flicked to the ledger hidden beneath his doublet. Outside the courtyard, an engineer arrived with a cart and a young apprentice who kept asking questions. The warden watched them examine the ratchet and the cog. The apprentice touched the fractured seam and nearly retched at the smell of old grease and blood. The engineer said, this was a weak design. The cog is cast too thin where the driver bears. It will split under reverse load eventually. The warden's throat closed. The twist arrived like a cold hinge when the apprentice found an earlier notation tucked between leaves. A note in an older hand that recommended a reinforcing shim. That note had been crossed out with a ruler and the word, defer, scrawled beside it. The warden recognized the handwriting. It matched an entry 2 years prior, in the hand of a previous warden who had been promoted out of office. For the first time, the chain of responsibility widened in the warden's mind. The flaw was not new. It had been seen and deferred. 2 men in the courtyard spoke quickly in low tones. Warden, the engineer said, this must be made known. Another machine could fail. Lives. He stopped when the warden's face hardened. No, we record and we strengthen. The warden's voice cut the engineer off, but not a public scandal. Not now. He looked at the apprentice and then at the cart. He folded the crossed-out note into his palm and slid it into his pocket. The public aftermath seared into the day. The executioner was replaced in the ranks after a private council. He would not again operate the rack. The condemned's fate was delayed while surgeons argued survival. The warden oversaw the removal of the broken cog in a midnight operation with 3 men who swore on oath to heavy silence. They wrapped the pieces in oilcloth and lowered them into a crate. A small confrontation later that night set a minor cliffhanger. The apprentice, fevered with conscience, waited outside the warden's door and knocked. Warden, he said, when the door opened a crack, you cannot hide the ledger. If you do nothing, another man dies. The warden closed the door slowly. He kept the ledger, he kept the broken cog. He kept the choice. Few words were said in the council room the next morning. The senior official read a prepared statement that emphasized accident and misfortune. The warden sat with his hands folded and listened to the phrases. cataloguing which lines would satisfy the council and which would not. The executioner's name was not pronounced in accusation. The condemned was taken from the dock with rope marks and bruises and a new, quieter public sympathy. The warden walked away from the meeting with orders to manage witnesses and remove the assembly. He nodded and then set about executing the orders. In the alcove, the ledger and the box of broken parts were set on a bench. The warden opened the ledger to the page with the crossed-out recommendation, stared at the line of black ink, and then drew his quill near the margin and wrote a single sentence. Maintenance complete. He did not sign it. He did not add a date. The apprentice's confrontation remained a quiet, unresolved threat. He began to speak with the condemned's sister outside the hospital, where the condemned man was recovering from partial release of his bonds. She questions about the broken cog and about the executioner. The apprentice answered as best he could without peril. He said the warden had acted to minimize scandal. The sister's face closed into a hard, small fury. She promised to speak to the town magistrate. The warden moved to conceal physical evidence. He ordered the disassembly of the mechanism and instructed 2 trusted guards to remove parts to an unmarked storeroom beneath the tower. He them to burn the oil, stained rags, and to scuttle the cog pieces into a pit under stone. The guards nodded and did the work. They did not ask questions. They were men who obeyed orders. When the cart left the tower under cover of dusk, the apprentice followed at a distance. He watched the cart deliver the crate not to the council house, but to a narrow cellar behind the blacksmith's where old tools were kept. He watched the lid open and the warden's hand take out the ledger and lay it beside the cog. The warden lit a candle and watched the metal glint. Some things are not for the public eye. Some failures must be controlled. The apprentice said nothing and walked away. A month later, the executioner was gone from public life. The condemned lived, scarred and mute for a while, then spoke occasionally to visitors who came with cups of broth and whispered theories. The warden continued to list maintenance in the ledger and to cross out inconvenient margins. The apprentice left his post within the year. He carried a single page from the ledger folded inside his shirt. The final scene of the chapter is small and concrete. A cart returns to the tower at dawn, empty but for the smell of burnt oil. The warden stands on the platform and feels the stone under his boots. He looks at the place where the rack once stood and touches the spot where the cog had been mounted. He says to no one in particular, "We will not let this happen again." He means it in one way and not another. The chapter ends with a single action that closes this episode. The warden locks the empty storeroom and hands the key to a junior guard with instructions to never open it without his presence. The guard takes the key with a steady hand. The ledger remains in the warden's satchel. The cart that carried the pieces to silence is gone. The smell of burned oil lingers on the stone and under the warden's nails. The last line is a concrete beat. The junior guard turns the key in the lock and the bolt slides home with a dull, final click. Ledger and reckoning. He pulled the cracked cog free and pressed his palm to the wet smear at his side as the warden, and a guard slammed the workshop door behind them. Betrayal tasted like oil and iron on his tongue. The executioner felt it as a physical heat under his ribs and called for a rag with a voice that did not tremble. The problem was plain in the first breath. A cog that should have closed teeth had a hairline fracture, and the ratchet's safety tongue had been filed down. If the ledger held proof somebody had swapped parts or ignored warnings, it would not merely stain a name, it would topple the tower's claim to competence. He had tightened the key over the condemned's chest just 2 days before. He remembered the ping of the ratchet, the man's teeth set around a dry sob, and how the executioner turned the wooden key until his knuckles atched. That memory sat beside the present pain, the red at his ribs and the ledger's loose pages hidden beneath the warden's table. The central problem was clear in his hands and the warden's eyes, exposure or concealment. Truth that could cost his post or let another die. The warden's face was small and clinical under the lamp. Hide it. The warden and the single syllable carried an order and a bargain. The guard behind the warden shifted leather, fingers on a hilt. The executioner looked at the torn tooth of the cog between his forefingers and at the warden's soil-stained hands. He had kept the rack running for 20 years. Duty and a steady hand were his trade. Now the trade split into a question: obey the warden and bury a danger, or speak and risk everything. He wrapped a rag around the cog and slid it into his cloak. He moved because movement erased thought. He moved because standing still let the warden measure his loyalty and find it wanting. They left the workshop together, 3 men who had spent a morning pretending nothing about the ratchet was wrong. Outside, the corridor smelled of damp stone and disinfectant vinegar. The warden's voice remained low and precise. Seal the ledger. Pack the broken key with old tools. Say nothing to the council. We make a note that the device failed, and that is the end. His words were not a plea. They were a command dressed as maintenance. The executioner heard a second, darker offer folded inside. Protection for silence, a promise of a role preserved if he bent. The executioner hesitated on the stair. Guards moved like an unspoken tide beneath them. He remembered the condemned's hands on the ropes, the way the man had rasped. They altered it. And how those 2 words had been pushed aside with a grunt and a brandished authority. That sentence, they altered it, had lodged in the executioner's throat and would not leave. In the infirmary, the condemned lay pale under a thin blanket. He had been brought from the rack room hours earlier, hair matted, breath shallow. The executioner watched with his jaw set. The condemned's voice came in a single, brittle thread. The warden did this. He whispered. He them to make the key tighter, to file the tooth. They wanted the show to end clean. His accusation landed between 2 men, the executioner and the warden. The warden's spectacles flashed. He catalogued the accusation out loud with the same voice he used for inventories. You speak wild things, Thomas. The warden and Thomas, this condemned, pulled the blanket tighter and spat a short laugh. You were wheeled out for spectacle. You speak to save yourself, Thomas? The ratchet pinged wrong. I smelled the oil on the cog. I told the gaoler and they laughed. The ledger hides the warning. The ledger hides the fix. His words were punctured by coughing. The executioner repeated nothing. He felt 2 emotions cave into one another, suspicion hardening into fear, and then into a deliberate coldness. He could not ignore the condemned's claim. If the warden had tampered with maintenance, the executioner had been complicit by closing his eyes. A guard left and returned with a torn page folded in his palm. He set it on the table and did not meet the warden's face. The paper was jagged along one edge. Ink blood where a hand had smudged writing while fingers shook. The executioner leaned in and read the single sentence that changed the room. Substitute cog installed. Previous safety warning dismissed. The letters were cramped, as if written by someone edging toward panic. The warden's nostrils flared. He stepped forward and reached for the page, but the guard held it back with a flat hand. This is nonsense. The warden. His fingers tightened on his spectacles. A clerk erred in notation. Old tools fail. You know how these things are, where human error. His mouth formed the words that deflected guilt, the practiced phrases that protected institutions. The executioner watched the warden's hand tremble, the way the oil at his fingertips pulled faint black lines across his knuckles. The executioner spoke then, a low voice shaped like an anvil. You signed the maintenance log 9 months ago. You wrote the replacement. Your hand is on that page, warden. You me to Morty's the tongue thinner. You me the change would not matter. He named the warden and the ledger and the action. Naming tightened the room into a trap. The warden's face narrowed. You accuse me without proof, he said. You would undo order for a scrap of paper. The guard who had brought the page shifted. The condemned coughed and then laughed again, a sound that was part spite and part fear. A spare clerk appeared at the doorway, a narrow man who kept his eyes fixed on the floor. He hovered and then offered a second torn page. This one smudged with grease, found in the chest, he said, near the lock. I thought it might help. His voice was small, but the presence of another hand in the ledger made the accusation a motion no one could quite shrug off. The executioner took the page and flattened it with a thumb. The warden's jaw worked. They moved to the stairwell to speak in private. The executioner held the torn pages against the stone to read in steadier light. "The ledger calls it substitution," he said. "It names the part and the engineer who warned against filing the tooth." The engineer's note is answered by the warden's initials. He felt the betrayal again as a physical thing, like a throat closing, then shifted it into anger. That anger was a clearer fuel. If the warden had willfully replaced recommended parts with cheaper cogs to save coin or time, men had been set to pain. The warden did not flinch. He offered money beneath the table of his voice and threats in the open. "You will take a pouch and forget what you saw," he said, "the silver clinking like a promise, or you will speak and lose home and hearth. Which is it, man? Which will you risk?" He named the executioner directly. The executioner felt his shoulders tighten. He had a ledger to hide and a family's roof to protect. He also had hands that had learned how bone and leather responded to pressure. He clenched his jaw and heard the iron bell of his own history. He had never once failed to perform the rack when called. They argued in 3 quick lines that slid like stones. "Warden, you cannot," the executioner began. "You must." The warden snapped. "You will." "I saw the man on the rack, warden." You changed it, the executioner, and in his voice the guard heard the syllables of accusation. The warden leaned forward. "Spectacles ask you. You will be remembered for keeping order," he said. "You will not be remembered for a single page." He offered his palm. It was steady and not clean. The executioner looked at the palm and at the torn ledger in his other hand. He thought of Thomas gagging as his shoulders strained in the ropes, thought of the sickening snap when the ratchet sang wrong that afternoon. The choice tightened into a decision point: preserve his station or expose the ledger and watch the tower's authority fracture. He turned his face away and walked to the inspection hall, because the warden insisted on a public demonstration, and because the executioner could not let the warden dictate where truth would be shown. The inspection was meant to be a show of competence. The public hall filled with onlookers, the guard captain, a clerk or two, the faint-faced merchants who liked to see punishment done by the book. The condemned was brought thin and coughing to testify as the demonstration's private witness. The warden arranged the ratchet on the rack with the care of a man staging proof. He spoke to the crowd in a voice that measured the lead of every word. "We will engage the mechanism and show it functions. There is no fault in our maintenance." He meant order. He meant containment. The executioner stood beside the mechanism with the wooden key in his hand. He felt the cranial point of a decision at the base of his skull, a tightness that had the shape of resolve. He could turn the key, say nothing, and let the wheel of authority spin on, or he could stop and produce the ledger. He did neither. He took a breath long enough to taste the iron on it and turned the key, because turning would force a revelation either way. At first the ratchet sang the same brittle song it always sang, a ping, a metallic note. The crowd shifted. Then the tongue caught on nothing. The ratchet slipped. The wooden key rotated farther than it should have, and a high, grinding snap answered it. The mechanism did not give to the rack alone. The bar loaded with the warden's weight jumped. A ratchet paw that had been filed thin failed to hold. The executioner felt the harness slack as the bench tilted. The first body thrown back was the warden's. He toppled toward metal and sprockets with his spectacles slamming to one side. The executioner lunged to arrest him and caught the edge of a brace at the wrong angle. The ratchet, freed of the safety, drew both men with its hungry teeth. For a breath no one spoke. Wood screamed in small splinters. The condemned coughed and then laughed, a wet, surprised sound that was not entirely mockery. Guards moved, but rope and iron complicated motion. The executioner had trained to control bodies under strain. Muscle memory took him to the ratchet's key, to the place where the thin tooth had been filed. He tried to wedge a hook into the mechanism, and could not find a purchase where metal had been smoothed. The machine took advantage of the missing stop and seized. They were pulled into the mechanism together. The warden's hands clawed at the executioner's coat. The executioner felt the ratchet's teeth grind along his palms. Pain sprouted bright and precise across his fingers and up his arm. He thought for one clean second of the ledger pages and how a clerk's small theft of ink could decide whether men lived or died. He thought of Thomas's eyes and how the condemned had said the words aloud. Panic flickered through the hall like a thrown torch. A guard shoved at an iron brace and knocked it. Wood gave with a wet, terrible sound. The warden fell free and hit the stone in a heap. The executioner was left collapsed against the ratchet, ribs burning, his gauntlet split. A fragment of the cog lodged against his glove and ground into his palm. He tasted blood and vinegar and the dust of the hall. The clamour that followed was all action. Some men seized the broken mechanism and dragged the warden away, cuffs clanging as they found purchase on oil, slick wrists. Others rushed to the executioner, hauling him to a bench and forcing his gauntleted hands open to examine the crushed fingers. Thomas was untied and slid from the rack like a rag. He coughed and looked around with a face gone oddly lucid. The warden was arrested on the spot. He protested in a voice that tried to catalogue procedure and correctness, but the guards were not listening for order. They spoke instead of the ledger and of the torn page. The executioner lay with a cloth pressed to his side while men argued about inquiry and culpability. He watched that argument with jaws clenched and private fury hollowing him. The warden's designs had broken more than metal. They had broken the thin trust the public had in their rituals. At dusk, in the courtyard, the executioner watched a clerk slip a folded stack into a pocket with the lightness of a practiced hand. He saw the clerk's fingers close on the pages and felt that same old betrayal flick at him again, this time from within the institution. He stepped forward and seized the clerk's wrist. "You cannot take those." The executioner. The clerk looked up. "They are private notes," he said, voice high. "I am keeping them safe for the council." "Those are lies." The executioner. He had learned how to speak warden's words and guards' commands, and he used plain language now. "You hide names and let men hurt again. You will hand them over to the inquiry." The clerk's face paled. He stammered, He slid the pages like an offering into the executioner's hand and then tried to snatch them back. The executioner held them for a beat and felt the weight of ink and the heat of decisions line after line. He did not let the clerk take them. He carried the torn ledger pages to the infirmary. Thomas sat up, and when the executioner handed him the paper, his hands shook, but he read the entry aloud. Substitution confirmed. Thomas, warning ignored. His voice held no triumph. It held the thin ring of a man awarded vindication at great cost. The council convened the next morning. Men in sober doublets argued aloud and then in whispers. The ledger's torn entries were shown, and the warden's name appeared in ink, faint and undeniable. The executioner listened as witnesses were called, guards who had seen him carry the cog, the clerk who had pocketed pages, the condemned who had named the tampering weeks before. Each testimony nudged the case forward like a lever. The warden attempted to bargain with words and coin and memory. He argued it had been a necessary expedient, a substitution to ensure punishments did not stall, and a system that prioritized the Tower-esque schedule. He sounded like a man defending a ledger rather than a life. Guards on the stand named the engineer who had warned against altering the ratchet tongue. A note from that engineer lay folded into the ledger and was read aloud. "Do not thin the safety tongue." The engineer had written, "Risk of back, snap if worn." The words hung in the hall like an accusation sharpened into law. The executioner made a choice then that surprised even himself. He stepped forward and laid every torn page, every smudge, every cog he had hidden on the council table. He did not plead for leniency. He did not seek revenge. He spoke in a voice like struck iron. "I kept my hands to my task instead of to the ledger," he said. "I performed the rack when called. I tightened keys and turned mechanisms. I did not check the warden's replacement. I let silence be my counsel. I will not let silence be the Lord." His words were concrete and stripped of ornament. He named himself, the warden, and the clerk. Naming anchored blame. The council voted to detain the warden. Orders came down that the executioner be relieved from duty while his wounds were tended, and an inquiry unfolded. The condemned, Thomas, was taken under guard for examination and to give a fuller account. Surgeons probed his ailments and found that the broken mechanism had left him scarred but alive. The clerk was reprimanded but also suspected of saving pages for power. Several pages remained missing from the ledger when the executioner counted them. At night, after the hall emptied, the executioner sat at a bench and counted the ledger pages again. He felt both a small relief and a hollow that would not vanish. He had handed truth to men who claimed to seek it, and yet some pages had already been traded into pockets. The clerk's hands had hidden a single sheet, and the warden's allies had begun to whisper about lost records. The executioner rubbed his injured fingers and thought of a future where inquiry would meet institutional insistence. He visited the warden once more under guard at dawn, not to gloat but to understand. The warden lay in a small cell with oil stains still at his nails. He met the executioner's gaze without the protective slick of procedure. Why? The executioner. The warden's voice was small and flat. Order required speed. He said we could not let the public see a stall. We kept the shows short. We kept coins flowing. Men paid for certain kinds of certainty. It was pragmatic. He tried to make the word pragmatic sound like a defense. The executioner laughed once, a short sound without humor. Pragmatic killed a man, he said. Pragmatic filed a tooth. Pragmatic made you arrestable. He put the last torn page on the warden's lap, read it. Name your hand. The warden's shoulders curled. He picked at the ink with oil, black fingers, and for a moment his eyes softened. He mouthed names without sound. The executioner stepped back and let a guard take him away. The inquiry released its findings 3 days later in a small, methodical statement. Negligent substitution, dismissal of maintenance warnings, complicit concealment by one clerk, arrest of the warden, and a recommendation for institutional reform. It read like a ledger itself, ordered, precise, but with margins where the missing pages would have explained deeper motives. The executioner read it twice and found in the final paragraph a phrase that lacked the sharpness he wanted. Procedural failures contributed to injury. He folded the paper and carried it to the infirmary. Thomas gripped the paper and read aloud the dry sentence. He looked up at the executioner and said, "Procedural failures do not close wounds." His voice was steady and not pleading. He slid the paper back. The executioner went to the courtyard that night and found the clerk who had slipped pages into pockets. The clerk's face was pale with the look of a man who had seen his small theft expand into a scandal. The executioner did not shout or accuse. He stood and watched the clerk button his doublet and think of escape. You had a choice. The executioner. The clerk swallowed. "I thought I was keeping the tower safe," he said. The executioner let the sentence hang. Then he turned and walked away without striking the man. He had not required vengeance. He had required truth. The clerk would live with what he had done. That would suffice for now. The ratchet lay in the yard, dismantled on a cart for further examination. Men from the engineers guild took measurements, drew diagrams, and shook their heads at the small cruelty of a filed tooth. Repairs would be ordered. Training would be required. The council would debate. The executioner sat on the cart under a lamp and watched the men work. He traced with a finger the shape of a missing tooth on a spare cog and felt again the coldness of betrayal shift into a slow, controlled sorrow. He visited Thomas once more before the condemned was taken to recovery. Thomas pressed a small, battered keeper's locket into the executioner's palm. "Keep it," he said. "It is lucky." Thomas' hands were steady now. The executioner accepted the worn metal and placed it beneath his doublet where it would be near his heart. When the executioner left the infirmary for the last time, the tower's lamps were guttering. He walked past the courtyard and saw the clerk slipping from one shadow to another with a bundle at his hip. He did not move to stop him. Some pages had vanished. Accountability had been partial. The warden would be tried and perhaps punished. The executioner had chosen exposure over silence and had been punished with injury and the temporary loss of his duty. He had traded a rufous certainty for a truth that would live in council minutes and in Thomas' testimony. He paused at the stair where the ratchet key had first split his thought. He set the small cog he had kept on the stone and pushed it into a crevice where no hand would easily find it. He did not bury it because he wished secrecy. He tucked it where visitors might one day find a remnant and ask a question. A clerk called his name from the gatehouse for a final inventory of tools and pages. The executioner lifted his head, fixed his gaze on the man, and walked toward the council chamber with a steady step. He moved because action had become the measure of his choices. He moved because the ledger pages now had to be read aloud to men who could not pretend ignorance. Outside the chamber, the executioner hesitated, set his injured hand to his side where the cloth bound the new scars, and passed the torn page to a guard with a single, flat instruction. Take these to the council. Read them until the ink is known. The guard took the papers and nodded. The executioner felt resolve sharpen into a simple, practical thing. He did not look back. The last sound the courtyard carried was the guard's boots on flagstones and the faint scrape of paper as the torn ledger moved into official hands. And in that scrape the executioner heard the faint promise that some truth, though mangled, would be counted.